So, good afternoon, David and Amanda. Welcome to this uh, interview about the realities connected with medically assisted suicide and euthanasia. I want to begin this conversation with just an invitation to think aloud about where you entered into the challenges around this subject. Um, David, one of the things that really struck me about presentations you did with us earlier this year was that you have actually walked with people in a spirit of accompaniment in the process of their choosing MAiD, and you've stepped back from that. So, could we open that up a little bit and just what is it about that reality that you chose to step back from, and can you open that up for us?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. And thanks, Amanda. Great to be part of this important conversation. So, right, I'd been a hospital chaplain, interfaith chaplain for over 25 years, and in palliative and cancer and intensive care. And when MAiD was legalized in 2016, it fundamentally changed our relationship to dying, and it changed the very nature of my work, because as the years progressed, it became increasingly a regular part of the conversation in clinical rounds, and more people were requesting it. And as their spiritual care provider, um, I had already established a therapeutic relationship. I had been supporting them, some of them from diagnosis on, and now into their dying, and they wanted me to be there for the MAiD procedure. Um, Out of fidelity to my calling and obligation to the patient, and great sense of I'm going to support this person. I would go to the bedside and I'd be present for the procedures. And I was struck right from the start how it felt fundamentally different than death from natural causes, whether that be the disease process, or sometimes there's death from uh, side effects of aggressive chemotherapy or a failed stem cell transplant. And I felt that viscerally. My body registered my distress before my mind could articulate it accurately. Uh, After the first procedure, I went, which was a very, what people would say, a dignified and a beautiful death through MAiD, right? The room was filled with gratitude and appreciation and acknowledgement and awareness, and there was great love. And yet something hit me in the gut, and I had to go back to my office and sit, and I was no good for anyone for the rest of the day. And the more procedures I was present at, the more I became confused as I was wrestling to find the accurate words. Because when we are experiencing moral distress, unless we're able to articulate that accurately, the distress will only increase. And most people will avoid that through maladaptive coping strategies or just distraction. But I can't do that because I'm embedded in it day after day. I swim in suffering with the dying. And eventually, it was compromising my ability to function. It was interfering with my sleep. Um, I was experiencing some burnout. I was not able to provide care as I felt I could. So I had to make a clinical decision, which I checked in with a bioethicist and my manager and with doctors, and found that we have an obligation as healthcare providers to step back from any aspect of clinical care which compromises our ability to provide care to everyone else. We have a moral obligation to do that, an ethical responsibility to all the patient population. So that's what I did.
Mm.
Uh, I said I no longer can participate in MAiD cases. I will support the person up to their first assessment. If they get assessed, then I have to step back and I make a referral to another chaplain to provide care. That didn't sit well with me either because I felt like I was colluding. And as a result of all of this, I retired early from spiritual care, a profession I love, and now have a private clinical practice. And as a result, I also wrote a book about medical assistance in dying and the spiritual dimensions of it. And that helped me find those accurate words to state what is missing with MAiD, what is the huge existential reality that we are avoiding through this procedure.
Mhm. Mhm. The book is coming out in the summer, and the title of it?
Early Exits, Spirituality, Mortality, and Meaning in an Age of Medical Assistance in Dying.
All right. Amanda, your entryway into the issue, what if you were to articulate it in terms of the I'm not looking for the dreadful side of it, but the hopeful side of it. What is the hopeful entryway into this whole thing for you?
Well, for me, I would say it was my relationship with my grandfather. I had a wonderful relationship with my grandfather, a Polish Jew who came to Canada in 1937, thank God. And he lived with my family throughout my high school and university years. And we were very close. He was my intellectual sparring partner. I would put the term papers that I had written on his pillow, and he would put the Canadian Jewish News on mine. We had debates about God, about politics, about ethics, about all kinds of things. And it was a real gift having him in a family home with my parents and my younger brother. And what I gained from his presence was a lot that is continuing to bear fruit even still. And what made me sensitive to euthanasia is the fact that it was precisely while he was living with us that the government started talking about euthanasia for those whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable. And anyone who has a 90-year-old living with them or is in their 80s or 90s themselves knows that death is reasonably foreseeable. And so I saw this as a potential affront on my own grandfather. And so this started to concern me personally, because my grandfather definitely had moments toward the end of his life where he would have been tempted to ask for euthanasia had it been legal, had it been available, perhaps after surgery or during a bout of difficult time, even though he had the support of a loving family and had many things going for him. His mind was sharp. I saw the susceptibility. I saw that with age comes a kind of apprehensiveness about the value of one's own life. But I was always able to see that value, not even as much as I can now. I think I cherish him even more deeply, and the memory of him continues to kind of grow in my heart. But the presence of him in my life undeniably sensitized me to the risk, particularly and initially to the elderly and to the great, tremendous loss that particularly young people would suffer by having the older people in their lives leaving them prematurely. And for every single visit I had with him, it grew me and enhanced me. And I just could not imagine the sort of short-circuiting of all those occasions that I had to love to come out of myself, especially as a teenager and as a young adult, very sort of preoccupied and absorbed as young people can be with their own lives and priorities. He was constantly calling me out of myself. And yeah, just for boundless reasons do I see that relationship was probably my early foray into being very alarmed about any devaluing of life through euthanasia.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the conversations that I've had in relationship to MAiD was with an ethicist, and I asked her what is her core concern in relationship to MAiD? What is the most pressing issue as far as so she works within Catholic healthcare. And she spoke to me not about the specific cases, but about an attitudinal shift that is unfolding within Catholic healthcare and indeed wherever MAiD is being adopted. That attitudinal shift, which essentially says that people who are vulnerable, are dependent on the state and so forth, should consider the possibility of ending their lives. That it's an attitudinal shift which actually suggests that this is one of the realities that you should weigh in terms of your decisions about your life, and perhaps alleviate the burden that you are holding for the society that you live in. Now I'm putting kind of my own words to what she was saying, but that's essentially what the message I got was that this is something that that is beginning to unfold, and maybe unfolding rather quickly within our healthcare facilities, and within the broader population, that that shift from we take care of and look out for those who are vulnerable, and now we look at them as a burden, and with the invitation to possibly extinguish their lives. So when we have that kind of attitudinal shift possibly unfolding in our community, or probably unfolding, and we want to challenge that within a polarized society, what thoughts would you offer in respect to how to go about that?
I've never heard a healthcare provider propose that perspective to a patient, but I've seen countless patients express it to me. I don't want to be a burden on my family. I don't want to be a burden on the system. Somebody else needs this bed. So if that is a pressure, I believe it's mostly subliminal, and I hear it more from the patients than I've ever heard from a healthcare provider. But it is being normalized. This sense of, well, I don't have a purpose. Let's remember that the main factors driving requests for MAiD are not physical pain, which is what the legislators thought it would initially be. It is predominantly existential distress. So I don't like dying. I don't like not having a purpose. I can't function in my work, my family, my world. I don't like being dependent. I don't see anything. I don't want to put my family through this. These statements are expressions of what Kathleen Dowley-Singh, a great hospice worker, and others call the deconstruction of your ego identity. Yes, who and what you are is being eroded away by the dying process, and you do not have, in the end, any function in the world other than your ultimate assignment, which I would propose is teaching us, the living, how to be fully embedded at your side, not turning away from suffering in any respect, how to pour our compassion, how to be walking with you and feel the wound of love, which is grief, how to realize that we are ennobled. Amanda, you've spoken of that. Your care for your grandfather ennobled you, or deepened your humanity. And we are better as a community because of this. I remember speaking with a man who couldn't see the point of putting his daughters through this. And I said, can you imagine you're teaching them the ultimate lessons a parent could ever impart? How to be awake to the gift of an ordinary moment, how to love through suffering, how to find the better part of themselves in the worst part of life, right? Big lessons.
Mm-hmm.
The poverty of our culture in pushing an option to exit early because you don't see the point in it. We're talking about moving into a state of consciousness the rational mind is incapable of comprehending. And it is part of the wisdom wired into the natural process of life. So your question again was, how do we engage that? And I would say, how do we do it pastorally? We've got to find common ground first. And that ground is found in acknowledging the difficulty of the struggle and listening to each other first before challenging each other.
Okay. So if I would, just a bit of feedback in terms of your response, I sense that in your commentary, you're cautioning me about the way I'm looking at that in terms of where the healthcare providers are coming into this mix, and just suggesting that attitudinal shift is not something that is widely embraced.
I think that, as with most cultural shifts, it's not intentional. It's a message that is subconsciously, right, and laterally implied, and then people find themselves agreeing with it, and then it snowballs.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Amanda, when you think of the polarized situation that we find ourselves in, and engaging that conversation with our community, our politicians, our healthcare workers, our faithful within our communities, what thoughts do you have about it?
First of all, I think it's very important to take seriously the accounts that people give of their own experiences. So thank you to David for mentioning this existential motivation when it comes to requests for euthanasia. According to the government's own report, the Health Canada annual report on euthanasia in Canada, it says that the main kind of suffering that leads people to request euthanasia by their own admission of those seeking it is a loss of ability to participate in meaningful life activities. And so I take that cry of the heart very seriously. Can we lose the capacity for meaningful life activities? This is a question that concerns all of us. We all have activities that we find meaningful that are precarious, that we could lose by our aging and by injury, by accident, by loss of relationships of people in our lives, a whole number of factors. So how do we make sure that our sense of meaning and the value of our lives is not subject to collapsing and disintegrating due to illness, disease, or loss? I think this is a question for all of us, and this is why I think this conversation concerns people of all ages and all stages, because we have got to stake our meaning and our identity in something more robust than something that can be lost. Otherwise, we are going to make our own existence very, very tenuous and not know whether it's good to be in the world at all, apart from what we can do, apart from what we can achieve. And everyone is looking to have an identity grounded in something more fundamental and more resilient than utilitarian considerations or things like that. And then on the part of people who are involved, I have read, for example, the accounts, and I have listened to people who are involved in euthanizing patients, and they actually think that they are doing something good. They believe that they are doing something compassionate. And it is so important for us to remember that there is not a sense of trying to willfully kill people and do evil acts, but there is a confusion, a sincere confusion about the good in those with whom we vehemently disagree on these fundamental bioethical questions. And the reason why it's important to bear that in mind is because I must never dehumanize even someone who I think is harming others, because otherwise I participate in the very act that I'm trying to mitigate against. If euthanasia, suicide, any form of affront to the human person is an affront to human dignity that I am trying to oppose, then even in my posture toward my opponents, I must make space for them to be received with a gaze of love. Otherwise, my posture toward them is antithetical toward the life-affirming mission that I purport to advance. And so it's a big challenge, but I think it's important, particularly within communities of faith, that we always leave room for the capacity for a person to turn around on this issue. And that will change our capacity to regard those with whom we disagree with affection. That does not always come naturally, but it is the only way, personally, that I have the perseverance and stamina in this work.
Okay. A matter that has surfaced in some of the conversations I've had is the question of funerals following MAiD. And so it poses some problems, among which would be the sort of the suggestion that this is a part of the normalizing process, a part of the acceptance of the reality. So thoughts about that reality as it impacts our society. The reason I asked the question is that there are concrete experiences in my own circle of connections of people who have been very distressed by the withdrawal of funeral services or that type of thing. So I know that there are pastors within our communities that are really struggling with how to respond. Any thoughts on that reality?
That's a pastoral care question, as well as a theological question. I think that the MAiD procedure reflects a spiritual poverty, low spiritual intelligence in our culture. And they're not aware of the dynamics of ego deconstruction as a natural functional process at the end of life that leads to more robust community, more energized compassion, and final states of consciousness in sublime transcendence, which is really universal. Even end-of-life rituals now are becoming more and more surface. When the task of spirituality is to be completely authentic and to know yourself as you truly are, beneath the layers of thoughts and story and feelings and ego identity, what are you fundamentally? The funeral is there, we know, as much more for the living, I feel, than it is for the dead. It's there to help people grieve, but it's going to be increasingly held in a language that is going to reflect the level of this spiritual intelligence. As a Lutheran pastor, I have conducted funerals for people who've committed suicide and for people who have died by MAiD. And in those, I've tried to accurately articulate the existential pain that the individual was in. And I strive not to judge them for their choice, though I may personally disagree with it. I leave them to the grace of God and to a dimension that is beyond my scope of practice, right? The afterlife. But I still will name the poverty of our spiritual intelligence as we try to engage suffering, and how in many respects there are family members there who feel that they failed in meeting that and are wrestling with it. So you have to be very gentle, very pastoral, and yet nonetheless, I feel very accurate in your vocabulary as you speak to this. It's a delicate issue.
I have the sense that there isn't a one-size-fits-all response.
No, there never is. Never is at the end of life. We're dealing with the the unfinished love story, the unspoken words. We're dealing with the life cut short and the void left behind. How can one ever speak accurately into that other than incarnate the compassion people are looking for and be that shining light of love?
Mhm. I'm just going to pursue this just a little bit further, but I do want to hear from you, Amanda, as well. But the reference to suicide, and within my own Catholic tradition, the reference to suicide, I think, is important because we have done a fair bit of damage in terms of the way that we have responded to people who have died by suicide in the past, with the exclusion of people from graveyards, the shaming of individuals and families for the choices that an individual made in respect to ending their lives. I sense that we are beginning to move past that, maybe even in substantial ways, but there's still traces of that within our community. And so, to my mind, there are some parallels in terms of what we do here. There are differences because we're dealing with a sort of a situation where the larger community is really beginning to identify acts which involve levels of moral choice, ending my own life or having someone end my life, which normalizing that is problematic. So you don't have that with people committing suicide. It's fairly universal that individuals who are families experiencing that kind of reality are struggling in a unique way. So there's connections and there's significant disconnects with this. So I just wanted to kind of, I don't know if you have further thoughts about that, either one of you.
Thank you for raising that. I think it's important to point out that euthanasia is suicide, and unfortunately, it's a kind of suicide with which others are concurring with the person battling suicidal ideation in the devaluing of his or her own life. And that's very unfortunate, but we have in many cases, bystanders, and then we have those who are performing the euthanasia who are directly complicit in agreeing with the person who wants to end his or her life, agreeing with that suicidal ideation. And the agreement in the devaluation of a person's life is extra tragic beyond an individual who may experience that. That's already tragic enough. But when others pile on the devaluation of a life and agree with it, I think that's even more devastating. And when we look at how the church has regarded those who commit suicide, and you mentioned kind of some changing perspectives there, I think what it really comes down to is a recognition on the church's part of the lack of freedom in the human act. We know that in order for an act to be a mortal sin, it needs to be grave matter with full knowledge and full consent of the will. Well, euthanasia and suicide always concern grave matter, obviously. It's always a grave matter. But for these other two criteria, knowledge and consent, we recognize a real lack of pure freedom, of true human freedom for someone who chooses to end their life, because the freedom is diminished through this act. It is not actually actualized. It is impoverished, unfortunately. And so we regard the act with that in mind, and also the will and the consent. First of all, persons do not really know what they are choosing when they opt for death. And as St. Augustine pointed out in his book on the free choice of the will, people who desire to die don't really desire not to exist. They desire certain goods. And we can see that even in the accounts of people opting for it, especially in the court cases. People say that they want autonomy or dignity or relief. All of those are, in a certain sense, goods of the human person. and they are not realized by eliminating life. And so even a libertarian like John Stuart Mill would argue that it is not freedom to alienate your liberty through either selling yourself into slavery or through suicide. And so I think it's very important that we address these criteria of human acts, the nature of the act itself intrinsically, the freedom of the person, and the will. And this is what allows us to have a merciful regard toward persons, recognizing that it is incumbent upon us to do much better formation, not starting when a person is suffering and dying, but much, much earlier. And this is why we see such a crisis in our time and our culture, because of a serious dearth of formation around themes of suffering, death, meaning, and hope. These are not things to begin learning when you receive a terminal diagnosis or when a loved one is starting to express some suicidal ideation and ask for an assessment. No, that's too late. We must come to these questions earlier. We need a really early start.
I love what you just said there, Amanda, because psychologically it dovetails with the principle of cognitive constriction. Now, this is something someone who is considering suicide or euthanasia, or anyone, frankly, who is really stressed is going to undergo cognitive constriction, where blinders come on. You're unable to contemplate alternatives that are much more satisfactory, much more life-giving, much more, right? You go down a dark tunnel. The further down that tunnel you go, the less options you're capable of seeing. So it is incumbent upon us as community to step up to those people and help them experience that sense of inherent dignity that they have. But you're right. If you do it at the end of life, you're late in the game. It's got to be part of our whole life journey. And our culture is one now endemic with loneliness. Right?
Mm-hmm. And if I cannot see the
isolation.
value of my life, what I need most is not someone to corroborate my inability to see any value to my life. No, I need someone to be the counterpoint to that attitude and to bring me out of it. And we do this in all forms of suicide prevention. But now, unfortunately, due to discrimination and exclusion that is completely unjustified, we have a society in which some persons receive suicide prevention and others receive suicide assistance. But it is always, always an act of love to mount resistance to a person's suicidal ideation. That tug of war with someone who has that constriction is such a gift for them, because it helps the person to rehabilitate a broader horizon than what they are capable of in their own individual power, which is constrained in that experience.
Mm-hmm. So if I could just pursue a little bit further with you, Amanda, on this, and the question of funerals, I realize that's not within your sort of professional skill set or experience, I presume. But what do you have a sense of, the discernment process? I'm a clergy person faced with the possibility of someone whose life is ended by MAiD. What is the discernment process around how I can respond to that?
Well, yeah, it's a huge challenge, and I recognize those who are in some form of pastoral care live this reality day in and day out. I was just having a conversation recently with someone who shared that this is a rabbi who told me that he was asked to do a funeral next week, and within Judaism, there's the tradition of burying the person within 24 hours of death, and so it was very strange to receive a request a week out to do the burial. And so he said, I'll do it, but could you just tell me why the delay for this burial? And the person said, well, he's not dead yet. It's scheduled. And this was a very peculiar experience that is coming up more and more often for those who are doing this kind of care, and people are at a loss for how to contend with it because it wasn't a thing until 5 minutes ago. Realistically, this is all quite novel in our culture, even though there have been precedents for these kind of attitudinal shifts, as you refer to it. What I hear come up a bit more often in Catholic circles is the question of the anointing of the sick. And I would say of all the dioceses, the Archdiocese of Edmonton has the most clear-cut explanation for why a priest cannot go do the anointing of the sick when it is known that the person intends to die by euthanasia. And it has come up. I have heard from priests who find out the fact after carrying out the sacrament of the anointing of the sick that the person announces or lets slip, or some family member conveys that the person is scheduled to die by euthanasia. And the sad look in the priest's face when they share that this is what has happened, in the sense of just dejection, it's very heartbreaking. And we are losing so much in terms of, for example, missing the point about how those who are suffering and dying present the kind of peak occasions for spiritual accompaniment. And to ask for euthanasia is really to eschew those and to disfigure them, so that those who are trying to provide the spiritual care feel that there is a rejection inherent because of the rejection of that person's life. And funerals, as David pointed out, are mainly for the living to have an experience of ritual that helps with the acceptance of the loved one's death. But it's very difficult and it's very different to accept a death that someone has chosen. What fundamentally changes when death is something that a person grasps for and chooses and makes happen, versus something that naturally just happens to them. What the difference there is, when death is something that happens to us, there's a kind of acceptance and resignation that we can have. But when someone chooses it, it's like they have rejected the world and eschewed all the people who would otherwise be in their lives. It's a rejection. And so it's very hard to accept a person's death when they have chosen in their final moments to make a rejection of that community.
I have seen this at play. The patient not consciously rejecting the community, but I've seen the family feel it, and they feel they can't speak of that at the patient's bedside, so they talk with me outside of the room. And even greater than this is the patient rejecting the final state, which requires full surrender, right? The final state of the complete disintegration or deconstruction of your personal identity and allowing or opening up to the mystery. Those receiving MAiD are usually ideally suited to receive good palliative care. And actually, I think the majority of people receiving MAiD do receive palliative care, but the research fails to identify the level of palliative care they got. And I can pretty much guarantee very few of them saw a spiritual counselor or a chaplain. Very few of them had conversations about this process of ego deconstruction. That final surrender is marked in the research showing it's almost 90% of people. It's marked by peace. It's marked by equanimity. It's marked by, when pain is well controlled, it's marked by a profound existential connection to everything and a deep abiding love, independent of belief system. This is a foundational final stage in human development. Critical all the more then for the good conversations where you can say, thank you, I love you, forgive me, and goodbye. Critical for good pain management, where you're not chasing the pain, you're accepting the medication, even if it makes you sleepy. And critical for the patient to be coached or guided into a final state of allowing the same wisdom that brought them into the world to take them out of it under pretty well controlled circumstances without needing to accelerate the process.
Mm-hmm. One of the observations you made during our convention was that many of the people that you have journeyed with, perhaps most of the people you've journeyed with, actually are able to walk through the process of death and dying and embrace that challenge quite readily, given appropriate supports and so forth. The way I experienced your comment was really surprising how readily people can move towards death.
Yes, especially when you have gentle, endearing, and frank conversations about dying. What do you think death is going to feel like? What are you most scared of? How could that be managed? Have you had a conversation with the doctor about how death is going to affect you metabolically and how that can be managed? Have you had the hard conversations with your family? Or if the family's present, it's lovely to say, hey, do you want your mom to watch over you from the other side? Wouldn't that be lovely if she promises not to freak you out? You behave yourself, right? But that communion of saints to affirm the mystery, to be comfortable talking about dying instead of taking the ultimate act that avoids it. One of the ironies of this is, even though the main driver for MAiD is existential distress, once a patient is approved for it, their fear of death, their existential distress, goes down dramatically because now their ego has control over that very process, which naturally deconstructs it for your transformation, which means MAiD is an effective existential anesthetic. It numbs the material that is aching to be processed and released.
A good deal of the conversation around MAiD has to do with mitigating suffering, perhaps pain and so forth that's uncontrollable. One of the realities that potentially could emerge in the next number of years would be the legalization of advanced requests for MAiD. A focal point of that conversation appears to be the issue of dementia, which frightens the GGs out of most people, including me. I certainly would not welcome the possibility of dementia in my life. Your thoughts in relationships to that fear and to advanced requests and so forth?
I can start if you like.
Yeah. Let's recognize first that we live in an age where the lifespan of the average person is 2 to 3 times longer than it was in 1700. We're living longer into our disease process. But like the frog in the kettle syndrome, we're not aware of the implications of this increasing, changing environment. The rates of Alzheimer's and dementia are increasing rapidly, astonishingly. It is frightening. My own mother died of a type of dementia, which also resulted in a form of locked-in syndrome. And she and I talked about MAiD. It was one of the most difficult conversations we'd ever had. But she was not approved for it because she had dementia. So therefore, she didn't have competency. But now, that's not the case. I'm really worried about advanced confirmation or approval, because we're talking about entering into a final stage of life that, again, the rational mind cannot comprehend and is only going to result in your imagination becoming painful to you. The reality is brutal. I acknowledge that because I lived it. My mother suffered this way for 3 years. And yet, countless times we experienced such grace, such beauty, such compassion. My family surrounded her with love. we became better human beings because of it. And she was teaching us the ultimate lessons of love. I would never wish for anyone to go through this. And yet it is the reality. This does happen. And it calls on us as community to come together and to identify as well, why are people getting Alzheimer's and dementia? What are we doing to ourselves? It's heartbreaking, and it calls us to love.
Amanda.
Yeah, I want to mention the film that came out a couple of years ago called The Father, and it's a film with Anthony Hopkins, and it's extremely well produced, where basically it simulates for the viewer some of the disorientation of having dementia. And I think he is like the actor to win the oldest actor to win an Academy Award. So just like a great performance that really made me reflect by watching this film, that really puts the viewer in that position of kind of confusion and forgetfulness, and like it creates that experience in you a little bit, which is just great kind of filmmaking. But what it led me to reflect on is why do persons get dementia and Alzheimer's? Not in a scientific way, not in a physiological way of longevity and like this is how the mind like deteriorates. No. But in an existential or in a philosophical sense, in a sense that I want to actually ask, what is the logic of God in allowing this particular kind of experience in the human person? Like, what is he trying to teach us? And I think it's so interesting if we look at it in this light. It's like a lot of other things could happen to us, but no, this is what happens to us and to many, many of us. And in this age and stage of civilization, increasingly, this is the kind of end of life that people are experiencing, rather than just bemoaning that and begrudging that, because there are a lot of tragic dimensions to it. What changes if we instead consider what is there for us to learn? What is the strategy on the part of God by having this be the particular kind of phenomenon that is increasingly prevalent, with which we need to contend? And that posture toward these experiences will grow, or at least has the capacity to grow, our imagination for how to receive what is a very difficult end of life experience in those we love. And then just lastly, I'll say, we know that obviously caring for persons with dementia and Alzheimer's is exhausting, it's challenging, sometimes it's annoying, it's saddening, it's a whole mix of things that is a heck of a challenge for the loved ones, the caregivers, everyone. We don't know exactly about the interiority of persons with Alzheimer's and dementia and what is going on in them. And so there's a real presumption and conceit of knowledge. And there's also a projection of our discomfort, of our disdain, of our disgust, even sometimes a projection of our inability to contend with this particular experience that may not even be inherent to the persons themselves. And that ought to give us pause with regard to how we treat persons in this experience.
Yeah, we moved there from why did this happen to what are we going to do with it? And that is movement away from fixing to caring, right? And it's calling upon the community. It's calling upon our entire society. So this goes far beyond the patient, right? Suffering is privately experienced, but it is nonetheless a corporate event. And as you know, I think it was, who was it, Tilliard de Chardin or someone said, as long as one person suffers, Christ remains crucified. Right? It calls us, and only I think in that respect is it grace, because it calls us to come back to belonging and love and to be the people, right? Not to be alone.
One of the things that I take from the conversation we've had, and in terms of the initial question around polarization, is the entryway is a humble response. It's a humility before the mystery of suffering, and it's a humility before the mystery of others, and even a humility before the conflicts that we experience in perspective and vision of life. But to have a humility which will allow us to embrace a mystery which exceeds our own vision, which exceeds anything that any one person is able to articulate or embrace in themselves, but just to be attentive to that as a way forward, while holding to the dignity and the integrity of a position that will open that door to that reality, that will open the door to a life-giving vision, a strengthening vision for the community. And that's sort of for me, that's kind of a takeaway from the conversation and the entryway into the question of polarization.
Yeah, it's so important that we don't become morally indifferent in our efforts to be pastoral and to accompany people where there may be certainly gaps in formation, but it is so important that we put forward a more positive alternative vision, something that is more attractive, because honestly, euthanasia represents a settling, a compromise. It's not ideal. It is, as much as it may be idealized or romanticized in the media, it is really conceding to that sort of existential poverty that David touched on. And so it is also incumbent upon us to raise the bar and to expect more out of our lives and our deaths, but at the same time, that makes a ton of demands on us. And so we have to be willing to rise to the occasion, to do the difficult work of caregiving, to affirm those persons who do caregiving in a noble, heroic, self-sacrificial, and often thankless way. All of these steps toward building a culture of life are the demands that are made upon we who have this vision of what really could be. So it's demanding, but it's so worth it, because everyone deserves to have their life regarded with reverence from the moment that they come into being until the moment of their natural death.
Yeah, let's remember, people in the rhetoric of dignity are talking about a functional dignity. They don't want someone cleaning them up. They don't want to be dependent. They don't want to lie in bed and apparently be doing nothing, when in fact what they're doing is becoming everything. You have inherent dignity when you're a newborn child. You were utterly dependent upon your mother and your family to wipe and clean and feed and move you, everything. And you were regarded with infinite worth. Why would it be less so because now you're an adult? Because the ego doesn't like it. Well, that's the ultimate homework that's waiting for all of us. And you know what? I can't promise that I will be graceful about the process when it comes my day, right? I think I will be ornery and I will complain and I will have difficult moments. I pray the grace of God will sustain me and even more those who care for me when that day comes.
Well, when we've come to the hour point here, and so I want to thank you for taking the time to be with me and to share what your experience, your vision, your thoughts about this important subject, and I hope that it will serve others well and to help move this conversation forward.
Thank you for facilitating the conversation.
Thank you.
All right.
Great.
All right. Good. Take care.